be Job or another individual, allows the prophet to have a glimpse of God's conversation with Satan. There we read in verse 7, it says, "And the Lord said to the Satan, 'From where do you come?' So the Satan answered, 'From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it.'" A reminder, it's a good reminder, that the Satan is a created being who cannot be everywhere. Reluctantly, he answers the Lord, not really telling him anything. But what does he say? He says, doesn't he? He says, "From going to and fro on the earth and from walking back and forth on it." That's no answer, is it? Where have you been? You know, your children come home from somewhere we never had that problem because our children just talked. They just talked, so you knew everything. But some kids are not like that. You know, if you've got worries about some children, where have you been? Well, out. What have you been doing? Well, I've been doing stuff. Who have you been with? My mates. And you never get anything from them, nothing intelligent, just because, especially if you care and you're concerned. He was answering God, but not necessarily giving him any information. Now, every time I read verse 8, there it says, "And then the Lord said to the Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job?'" I always go to Luke chapter 22. And we have that discussion of the Lord with Simon. "Satan has asked for you, Simon." He says at verse 31 of Luke 22, "And the Lord said, 'Simon, Simon, indeed, Satan has asked for you, that he may sift you as wheat.'" And what we've got to realise, this is just after the disciples have been arguing who will be the greatest. Who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Who's going to? And after this, the Lord talks to Simon Peter. Something's going to happen to you. And he says, "But I have prayed for you, that your faith should not fail. And when you have returned to me, strengthen the brethren." What a statement. Imagine your pastor coming alongside you one day and saying, "The Lord has told me that Satan has asked for you to be sifted. But I'm praying for you. And when you return, strengthen your brethren." When you have learned from what you have learned, when God has humbled you, when God has broken you and built you up, come back and be a blessing to God's people. And what a thing to say. And yet that's what the Lord was saying, and we know the account, don't we? We know how that Peter, in front of all those people, cursed and swore that he did not know the Saviour that was about to die on Calvary's cross. Hardly a day would have gone by. Obviously, I wasn't there, but could you imagine Peter? Every morning, he would have been grateful that God still loved him. Every time, and they would have seen crosses. Every time he saw a cross, every time he saw a Roman soldier, he would be reminded. Every time he sat around a fire, he would be reminded of the time. The words would come flooding back to him. Oh, what I said. Satan wants to sift you. But I will pray for you. And when you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren. So the Lord says there in verse 8, to the Satan, he says, have you considered, have you set your heart upon, have you, you know when you see something and you want it and you want to take it, or and you set your heart upon that thing and you save like mad to get it, or it's a tray full of cakes and you skim past all the boring biscuits and you see that lovely cake that's just full of calories, and that's the one you want. You know how it is? This is what he's saying. He's saying, of all the people in the world, he said, Satan, have you not noticed? Of course Satan has noticed. Because he's a whole argument about the fact that God has put a hedge around him. I can't touch him. You've hedged him around. Of course Satan has noticed him. Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil? For me, this tells me that he was not at the time of Moses or Abraham. Job was unique in the earth. Something about this man. Now we have to remember something here. We all know, don't we, that the book of Job is about suffering. That's what we always think of. But it's not about suffering. That's not what the book, although in the first 3 chapters it's all about the suffering of Job. But it's not about the suffering of Job, as terrible as it was. It's not about suffering in general, and it's certainly not about the suffering common to humanity. This book is about the glory of God. That's what it's about. We get to chapter 38 and we begin to hear the Lord answering Job and his friends and reminding them of who he is. Were you there when? Are you able to understand like I understand? Remember when Jesus, his friend Lazarus, died? He was told that Lazarus was very poorly. It says there in Luke chapter 11 verse 2, therefore the sisters sent to Jesus and said, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. Lazarus is very ill. But as you read the account, the Lord seems to be very laid back about it. The Lord has other things to do. And we all know that, you know, when you've got something to do and you're trying to rush someone on and they won't rush and you can't do anything about it and there's an urgency almost. And here's the Lord, there's no urgency about him. And we go to verse 4, it says, when Jesus heard that, he said, this sickness is not unto death. You need to grab He told them before he died, before he went to the grave, he wanted them to know, look, this is not unto death. This is the reason Lazarus is sick. This is the reason Lazarus will be lying in the grave those many days. This is what it's all about. He says, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Lazarus has died. You have been broken. You have lost your brother whom you love, so that I might be glorified. It's tough, isn't it? You know, in a difficult marriage, and it'll never change. You've lost a loved one, and it'll never change. You've lost sons and daughters. You've been in umpteen marriages that have broken, and it's not been your fault. You've been faithful. You've been told that you have an illness that will never be cured. It's tough, isn't it? Life is very hard. You see, we are called in all this to bring glory and honour to our God. I'm not saying it's easy. What Job did was something extraordinary. I believe he's a type of Christ. There was something about Job that was beyond the ordinary man. Yet he was an ordinary man. Yet he grasped something of God that he was able, after he lost all things, to say, naked I came into the world, naked I leave. Now if you take time to read and get to know those who are God's friends, you know, something we don't do so much now, is it? You don't hear people talking to you about missionaries or the work that's going on overseas, or you don't hear people talking to you about the lives of certain individuals. But when you do, when you get time to read about them, even men of the past, an individual like Calvin who people ridicule because of certain things he taught, but that people took too far. Or you read of Martin Luther, or you read of Zwingli, and you read of these men from the years gone by, and you look at their life. They suffered terribly. You read of Wesley and Whitfield. They didn't have an easy life. You read of missionaries that have given their lives to God's work, and you read of what takes place in their life. And I cannot to this day read the life of Hudson Taylor. I just can't. If you said to me, do you fancy coming to watch a film about Hudson Taylor, I'd say, look, you go, you enjoy it. The very thought of how he suffered. He said this one day, he said, the fog in my life is beginning to rise, only to get even thicker. His life was so tough. Mary Slessor suffered so much. She longed for a husband, and yet she became a mother to so many children. Life was tough. That's what you notice about the friends of God. Something similar with all of them. In varying degrees, there will be people who know suffering. There's not one person who will come to their death in this place who loves the Lord that will not suffer at one time or another. And you will know suffering. And there will be times when the suffering will be so heavy and so hard. And yet, in the midst of it all, you wonder yourself, do you? How do I get through it? It's harder for those who are watching sometimes, those that are suffering. You don't know what to say. Yeah, we hold on to the Lord and he holds on to us. We are safe in the cleft of the rock. The God who says, I will never, ever let you go. I will never let you slip out of my grip. There is coming a day when you will stand on the shores of Jordan and you will be ushered home. And I will do that for you. But until that day, you may suffer. See, Job was God's friend. And he was about to be sifted by Satan. As Martin Luther used to say of Satan, he used to say, he is God's Satan. He is very powerful, but he cannot do what God will not allow him to do. You cannot touch one hair of his head unless I allow you. God allowed Job to suffer. Yes, it was Satan who brought the Chaldeans and the Sabaeans in to destroy his family. Yes, it was God who allowed Satan to touch his skin. But God said, you cannot take his life. Now, there are many in the church who are offended when they see God's people suffering. But they will suffer because it is part of the refining process. And this is hard, isn't it? I hate to see people suffer. I've heard ministers sit with people and they've said to them, God must love you because of all your suffering. I could never say that. I think, how could you say that? There are times when you just have to sit with someone. There are times when there is nothing to say. They know that you know that this is for the glory of God. But all they need is for you to just be quiet. Just hold their hand. Or to just sit with them and just be a friend. If Job's friends had carried on doing what they did in the beginning by sitting and being quiet, that would have been the best thing they could have done. But when they began to speak, they just really showed that they didn't fully understand. We read there in Psalm 66 verses 10 to 12, and this is hard. I remember they had a thing in the Holbrook's magazine about the refiner's fire and talking about refining silver. And you know, when the silver is pure and it's refined, you can the master, the one who's doing the refining, you can see his reflection in it, and it's a great little story. But not when you're the silver. It's not very easy, is it? It's not very comfortable. But there are times when we do go through that crucible, don't we? See what the psalmist says: for you have tried us, O God. You have refined us as silver is refined. Listen to it. You brought us into the net. You laid an oppressive burden upon our loins. You made men ride over our heads. We went through fire and through water. Yet you brought us out into a place of abundance. Takes us to Hebrews 11, doesn't it? And there are those that it doesn't mention. Those who died in terrible ways, who suffered terribly. They're not mentioned, and you think, Lord, I long for the day when I meet them and share with them about the wonder of what God has done. Satan, have you set your heart upon my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil? We have to remember that there is only one place where there will be no more tears, no more death, no more crying, no more pain. And we're told that in Revelation 21 verse 4 is heaven. That's the only place. Now that doesn't always give us comfort, does it? It's hard, isn't it? Life can be so difficult. You see, God asked the Satan if he had noticed Job. After all, that is the job of Satan, to notice those who trust the Lord. That's his role in God's government. But how does Satan respond? And verse 9 we read there, don't we? It says, so Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for nothing? Is it for no reason that he fears you? He's frightened that you'll take these things away from him. That's why he fears you. Job only fears you because you've hedged him around with good things. Yes, Satan agrees with the Lord. Yes, Job does look like one who fears God. But only because he has been blessed with such wealth and happiness. That's the only reason that he fears you. And the Satan says there in verse 11, it says, and it staggers me. It's in the imperative. He's almost commanding God. There he is in the presence, the irrationality of Satan. He's not in his right mind, and he speaks to God as if God is nothing. He says to him, but now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has. If you do that, it's your fault. That's why he is what he is, because you've blessed him. Stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. As we may know, the term God's hand is speaking of God's action. And to touch means to strike, to smite. God could have turned around and said, how dare you speak to me like that? But you see, instead, because of his glory, God allows the Satan to touch and take from Job all that he has. It's for God's glory. The Satan was correct, even though he speaks in an aggressive manner. There is no other way publicly to establish Job's true heart. There's no other way. It has to be done. And the Satan isn't having a simple bet with God. I've heard people say that. I've heard in Sunday school and youth, and I've heard from the pulpit as if Satan was having a simple bet with God, or bullying God. There was none of it. It was all about God. God asked the question. God reminded him of his servant Job. It was for God's glory. Christopher Ash says this, in some deep way, it is necessary for it to be publicly seen by the whole universe that God is worthy of the worship of a man, and that God's worth is in no way dependent on God's gifts. It is not because of God's gifts that Job loves him. Job loves him for who he is. Do you simply love God because of your salvation? But you love him because he first loved you. God who showed you his mercy. It's just the same as we were reminded the other week in 1 Peter 1, 6-7, where he talks to the church, the suffering church, and he says, you are going to have to go through suffering. Terrible suffering. They're already going through suffering. You will go through suffering. And it's all about, it's about the praise and glory and honour at the revelation of Jesus Christ, when Christ comes and we are raised, the church, the people of God that have been battered and bruised and sawn asunder and skinned alive and burnt and all that goes on. When we are raised, we will be so beautiful. The Son will look upon his church in all its splendour and glory, and we, the church, will glorify our God. We will have such pure hearts on that day. We need to remember that Satan has a ministry, the ministry of opposing the work of God, doing as the accuser of the soul does, testing the genuineness of the believer's faith. That's why Christians who don't live as they should live seem to live great lives at times until God pulls them up sharp and brings them back into the fold. But you know it, don't you? The minute you give yourself to daily reading the scriptures, the minute you say, I'm going to start to witness at work, the minute you decide to, all the powers of hell come down to stop you being what you should be. So God gives this terrible instruction and permission. Behold, all that Job has is in your power. Only do not lay a hand on his person. So the Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Up until this point, Job and his family were enjoying the temporal blessing of the Lord. Christopher Ash again says, a universe in which God is not glorified will be a universe at odds with itself. Ultimately, and it is ultimately, rather than immediately, the well-being of Job depends upon the glory of God, and the sufferings of Job are necessary for the final blessing of Job. And when we read that account, and I'll read it to you, he's the richest man in the East. He's the blessed man in the East. He's not only a blessed man in a sense that he has everything, but he is a believer in the Lord. He has everything without everything. And now it's going to be tested. Now there was a day when his sons and daughters, is verse 13 of chapter 1, were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were ploughing and the donkeys feeding beside them. Then the Sabaeans raided them and took them away. Indeed, they have killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Thousands of animals were slaughtered and taken. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burnt up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. You know how a thing devastates us? It doesn't take much, does it, to change our day? A little knock on the car, or just someone not saying hello to us in the morning. But here is this man, suddenly his business in a day is going. It gets worse, doesn't it? While he was still speaking, another also came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 bands, raided the camels and took away, yes, and killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he is still speaking, another also came and said, you know the ones you sacrifice for? You know the ones that you have raised from little babes? Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And suddenly a great wind came from across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. How devastating that must have been. We just can't take it in, can we? The protective hedge has been breached. Job receives one devastating message after another. The greatest man in Mesopotamia has been bankrupt in a day, and in a day has lost his family. Now, we don't read much about his wife, but what heartbreak there must have been in that home that day. We can't imagine it, can we? Forget my wealth, forget my possessions, but my babies, they're always your babies. If I am 95 and my son is 60, he will still be my baby. As much as he wants to be a man. But here is Job, he's breaking his heart. His poor wife. What was Job's response after receiving such terrible, terrible news? Verse 20 says, then Job arose. He tore his robe and he shaved his head. And he fell to the ground. Before he even had time to be crushed by the sadness, he fell down and worshipped and said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin nor charge God with wrong. How in tune with God Job must have been. How he must have loved his God. We read, don't we, there in, I think it's chapter 9, when he talks about his Redeemer. There was something special there. There was something about Job's relationship with God. Job knew that eventually he would die and take nothing with him. It's as if he understood that all that he has is from God. Job knows that God gives, and God has every right take away. There are times when we feel he hasn't got the right, don't we? I mentioned this morning, didn't I? Meghan Markle says we all have a right to be happy. We all have a right to enjoy the things of this world. Why should she have a right? And the millions in China, the thousands in North Korea have not got a moment to themselves. We live in a simple, broken world. There is only one place, as I've said, where we will have a right to be happy. And that will be in glory. And it will be because God has made it our right because of Jesus Christ. But that's not the end, is it? Still, there is another day when the Satan speaks with God and he's allowed to test Job even more. There in chapters 2 verse 7, so Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with painful boils. I think in the NIV it might be sores, but when you look at the original word, it's not just talking about boils on the surface of the skin. The impression you get is this man is reeked with sores throughout his lungs and his body. It's all coming from within. This man had nowhere to go to console himself. We'll look next week. He went out and he sat on the ash heap. The ash heap reminds us of that place that Jesus talks about, that place outside the city, that place that was like hell's fire. He went to the only place where he could find any sort of comfort was on the ash heap where the rubbish was thrown. Behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life. And Satan did. He took him to the very edge. Satan's argument was touch a man's possessions. That's one thing. But to touch who he is, to touch his flesh. You see, all that a man has, he will give for his life. Well, next week we'll continue to look at how Job, in all this, did not sin with his lips. What a man. When you just spend a few moments and consider this man Job, how he suffered. Well, we'll begin hopefully over the weeks that lie ahead to see how we see Christ in this man. We see how Christ gave up all to come that we might have life. That he suffered at the hands of Satan so that we might be blessed. Amen.